think a lot of us need to remind ourselves of that statement as we deal with the challenges of life.
Yes, indeed. And the absence of fear is faith, and vice versa. So if we can remember that, I know there was an older man who reminded his daughter of that because she prided herself on always being apprehensive for people, concerned about people. Only she say, "I'm afraid for that person." Mm-hmm. And he said to her once, "Do you realize that when you do that, and when you exhibit that emotion, then you're negating faith?" And she said, "No, I never thought of it like that." And she stopped being proud of the fact that she was always being concerned about others. And that if we can think of it in that way, that it is faith, the opposite of fear, then we wouldn't be as fearful.
And we need faith in ourselves as much as we need faith in the divine, don't we? And so often we may have faith in God, or we may have faith in our religious tradition, or we may have faith in certain people around us, but we don't have faith in ourselves.
That's right. And with God, all things are possible. And that saying has come to the forefront a great deal. We see it on all sorts of printed things, and it's true. But if we feel that God is with us, then we're not going to be fearful, and we will feel in our hearts that with God all things are possible, and indeed they are. And as we teach and as we are an example, then that's a very wonderful thing, to not be fear-filled and to show that we're not fearful, because everything is contagious, and when one person acts fearful, then others do. But if one person can just stay bold and in the face of adversity, then it affects everyone else. And we've all heard stories about people on ships and planes and trains and automobiles who are facing difficulty, and then just one person lights the atmosphere for everyone else.
Absolutely. And in our counseling work, we see so often when we have someone that is deep in fear and has a fear consciousness or an operation of mind that is always in fear, in a fearful state, those families are affected, aren't they? Because it affects the people around them as well as they themselves.
And parents don't realize how their fears really impact on the children, and children. It takes children a long time to get over that. The energy that's within them, instilled by the parents through fear. So the kindest thing we can do for anyone else is to allow them to not be fearful and encourage them not to be, set that example, and just assume that they're not going to be fearful.
In metaphysical New Thought, one of the definitions that's given of fear is to take those 4 letters and to give them words that help to remind us how it is we can overcome fear. And that simple definition that's used so often, again, in metaphysical circles, is false evidence appearing real. Our fears are really false evidence appearing real.
That's very good.
Yeah. And we believe the things that we fear to be real, but in fact, our fears are only resident in our mind, aren't they?
Yes. As you say, always we live in our minds, and that's true. And as we allow ourselves to be fear-filled, and there's not a whole lot of things that should make us all that fearful, but we have a tendency to do that. We think we don't have enough money, and we're not going to have enough money. Well, there's always enough money to live, and there's always that potential, that possibility. So the more we think we don't have enough, then the less we have.
That's always true of prosperity and abundance, isn't it?
Yes.
And it really has to do with the cycle of thought creating after its kind. And that is that when we begin to think from the standpoint of lack, when we begin to think in a fearful way, then we set up that reality for our lives. And so as we are fearful of being poor, we become poor. And that's true of us in spirit. It's true of us in the physical as well. If we believe in ourselves and our ability to create prosperity and abundance, then we are able, in fact, to create prosperity and abundance because of the very dynamic of our mind, because that false evidence appearing real is released. One of the things we talk about in prosperity so often is that when we look at a checkbook and we look at our paycheck and we don't have enough money to pay the bills and our bank account is depleted and we don't know how we're going to meet our resources, we need to be reminded of the fact that having that empty checkbook is in and of itself a wonderful and marvelous thing, because in today's environment we know many people who live in homeless and desperate financial situations who don't have a checkbook and have no hope, at least no seeming hope
Yeah.
at the present moment, of having income. So if we have a checkbook, even if it has nothing in it, the checkbook by its very nature should give us hope and faith and create within us the ability to release the fears that we're not going to have enough, so that we will in fact have enough and have more than we need. And that also holds true for the aspects of our health and our relationships and all of the other aspects of our lives. The fear cuts off, the fear paralyzes, and the fear stops our ability to have the things that we need to have.
And it stops the good from flowing, because as you just said, we stop that ability to accept, and we stop the ability to create, because we create daily, and we create that which we wish to, or that whatever we do, we're creating. And we are co-creators with Creator God. And a lot of people feel that that's being very presumptuous, but in fact it isn't, because God created us to live on earth and to flourish and grow. And so we are co-creators. But God gave us free will. So as we create, God doesn't stop us from creating whatever we want to. So if we create negative things around us, then we're not stopped by anyone on the inner planes. But on the other hand, if we're creating right and good and positive, then we're assisted from the inner, because that's what is on the inner planes, good.
Absolutely, and that good flows into and out of our lives.
Yes.
But as we cut off that flow with fear, we essentially turn off the light, if you will, and we begin to move into a state of darkness. We begin to move into negativity. We begin to move into a place of limit and lack, as opposed to prosperity and abundance. We move into a place of depression instead of happiness and joy.
Yes.
So.
And we do that just by creating a different energy. As we're positive, we create light energy. As we're negative, we create darkness. So we're creating and drawing to us that which is at the core of our being. And I couldn't impress on anyone more than to just be aware of that. Just think about it and be aware of it. And you are creating your own environment. You're creating that with which you live.
And we create it through the dynamic of mind.
Yeah.
And so often we say that we live in our minds and not in the world, and that our minds create the environment in which we live. Our minds, there's not a single thing in this universe that we can point to that wasn't a thought before it was reality. The chair that I'm sitting in was in someone's mind before they ever drew the plans for it and built the chair. The television that people are watching was in someone's mind before the concept was reduced to a plan, and then that plan was taken and executed to bring about the manifestation of the television. Everything is created by mind. There's not a single thing that isn't created by mind. And so fear stops the flow of creative mind. Fear stops our ability to create anything in a positive and affirmative way.
Isn't that a startling and wonderful thought? Isn't that a startling and wonderful thing, that we are able to create in our own right? And Job would be a prime example of fear.
Absolutely. Job, one of the real things that we miss in the story of Job is so often we like to say that the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away, blessed be the name of the Lord, and all of that it's a story of suffering, when in fact it's a story of exactly what we're talking about, giving up fear. And one of the things that Job said on a spiritual level, but it's also true on a material and mental level, is that which I feared has come upon me. The things that we fear come into our lives.
That's right.
And when we said earlier that fear is false evidence appearing real, we can take a false evidence in our life and we can make it manifest. We can create it in our lives, because the things that we fear come into our lives because of that dynamic of the creative power of mind. So our minds are creating, and if our minds are filled with fear, we're creating after that fear. And because of it, the very thing that we're afraid of will come. The people who are most afraid of being poor end up getting poor. The people who are afraid of becoming ill often end up ill. And in many cases, we can remember counseling and talking with people who have a horrible fear of some disease or some illness, or fear of the loss of a job, or fear of certain things. And many times those fears do become reality, don't they?
Yes, they do. I think of a woman that I knew many, many years ago who always said, "We have no money." She had a husband and 3 children, and they lived like the rest of us did in that neighborhood. But she was always saying, "We have no money." Well, obviously they had money because they lived there and they prospered and grew. But she developed a very dread disease, and I always thought it was because of that poverty consciousness she had, and she was always afraid of getting sick. And then she did, and she got multiple sclerosis, and she didn't live a very long life. But that, to me, is a primary example of what not to do with your life.
Fear consciousness, you just said it, and it's a tremendously important idea, because consciousness is the dynamic of our thought process, and a fear consciousness. And so many people who come to us, especially in our counseling work, are operating from a consciousness of fear, aren't they?
Yes, they are. And a lot of people think, well, life isn't fair to me, and so I have a right to be angry. I have a right to feel worried, to be fearful. Well, none of us have that right, because it's our God-given right to live a prosperous, wonderful, glorious life. And so it's not our right to do that. But that's the person who doesn't want to take self-responsibility. And in saying I have reasons for all this, then if they don't take self-responsibility, then they can just go back on that problem and say, well, that's why I can't do anything with my life. But if they would just realize what they're doing in their lives, then it would be a more glorious life for them.
Absolutely. And that concept of the fear consciousness robbing us and taking away the joy of living that we're entitled to, but that we just fail to claim, comes about through our own self-responsibility, or lack thereof, doesn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. And it comes back to this issue of self-responsibility. Yeah.
Always, always. And to consciously leave fear behind, sometimes we have to do that. We have to do it consciously, because we've been perhaps been brought up in that modality of thinking, or perhaps certain things have caused us to be down and not be able to pull ourselves up. But it's up to us to be self-responsible enough to realize what we're doing with our lives, and are we living the way we really want to live? If not, then we need to change.
If we're not living the way we want to live, then it is up to us to change, isn't it? And that doesn't detract from God, or it doesn't detract from spiritual reality, but we need to understand that we have personal responsibility, and that it is really, to a large extent, up to us.
Yes, and fear is one of the first things we can leave behind. And to me, it's one of the easiest things we can leave behind, because, again, if we have faith in higher powers, and faith in our own ability, and faith in who we are, children of God, then we can have the initiative to leave that fear behind and live a faith-filled life. And it's not being religious, it's not going to church, it's not any of that things. It's all just our state of mind, our consciousness level.
Our consciousness, and the way in which our consciousness and the dynamic of our minds operate. We'd like to pause at this point in the program and offer you the opportunity to receive some literature so that you can continue studying the concepts and ideas that we're sharing with you.
We would like to give you the opportunity to explore and discover in your own home the new thought teachings that this program is sharing with you by sending you a free copy of one of these booklets. Simply address your request to Confident Living at P.O. Box 7726, Long Beach, California, 90807. Whatever your dream, whatever your vision, you can reach it through confident living.
In the second half of the program, I think we need to talk a little bit more about fear consciousness and ways in which we can overcome that way of thinking or that dynamic of thought. One of the things that we talk about so often is living in the present time, or as we say in New Thought, living in the now. And by living in the now, we can very often begin the process of overcoming our fears, can't we?
Yes, because when we keep our consciousness in the now, in present time, then there's not room for the negativity, for a fear of the future or regret for the past, which is another way of being fearful for the past. And so there's only so much space everywhere, then there's unlimited space. But we can, if we consciously leave fear behind and live the opposite, if we consciously leave any other negative aspects of life behind and just use its opposite. And if we truly do that, then we're keeping our consciousness in the now, in present time, because anytime we live a negativity, we're changing the energy around us.
We're changing our mental
Right.
energy, we're changing the energy of our entire being,
Yes.
and we're changing the energy that we project to those around us.
That is so important,
Yeah.
because if we're surrounded by people who are negative and fear-filled, then if we can't change them, then we need to not spend as much time with that type of person. And a lot of people might think that's very callous, but it isn't being callous, because if we see we're not able to help those people, then we can just consciously not spend as much time with them. But then we do also need to spend time with people who are negative, if we can, and not be pulled down by it, because then our light and energy then will reflect out on them, and they will be more apt to pull away from their fear-filled life. But each person has free will, and it's each person's right to do as they please. So it's not our right to harangue at someone, but if they don't just get it by osmosis, then that's not our problem, it's theirs.
Right. And they'll learn it eventually.
Yes.
I mean, we all learn to give up our negative feelings and our negative emotions and our negative experience, because once we get beat up and beat up and beat up, we feel bad enough, then we come to that point. And we certainly hope and work with people to come to that point earlier. Very important point that you made a moment ago is that many people need to avoid the closeness with people who are fear-filled, because of the fact that they are so affected by that, and they become more fear-filled. It's a little bit like the two negative energies play off of each other. And so one of the ways to overcome a fearful consciousness or a consciousness of fear is to avoid people who are always in a fearful state. And sometimes that does mean making new friends and avoiding the acquaintance of those, and the friendship and the companionship of those who bring fear into our lives. The other thing that brings fear for many people is the news or the world.
Yes.
And if people find that that's the case, then they need to move away from those things. If the newspaper upsets you, don't read it. But the idea is to empower and strengthen yourself so that you will be able ultimately to come back and read the newspaper and not be affected by the fears. You will be able to come back and associate with anyone and not be affected by the negativity of their fears and the emotions that they have. But if that's not where one finds oneself at a point in time, then we need to move into a place of safety, and that is to avoid those circumstances. But the other issue is that those of us who are involved in the helping services, especially with those who have a fearful state of mind or consciousness, and all of us can help people who are in a fearful state at some point in time, but everyone can't do that all the time, can they?
Yes, that's correct. And we have to keep our wits about us and not lash out at people who are fearful, but to just calmly ask them for self-evaluation. But we don't say evaluate yourself, but we make them see what caused them to be fearful, and that we can just gently remind them, and then have them see for themselves. And then when we do, it's worthwhile staying with people who are negative and being around them, because it doesn't pull us down. We're creating that new energy of pulling them up. So, but most of us think that we have to just be responsible for other people. We don't.
Absolutely. And this issue of staying in the present moment is also tremendously important for our own ability to overcome fears. We talked about it just a moment ago, and that is that that our minds, the wonderful dynamic of thought is we can only have one thought at a time. We can have many thoughts in rapid succession, and of course our minds are constantly thinking about different things, and we're going from point to point. But when we're in the present time, if we keep ourselves centered in the present as much as possible, especially when we see ourselves moving into a consciousness of fear, then we can be aware of the fact that our minds can only think of one thought at a time. And so move our thinking from the thinking or the thought process of fear into a thought process of peace, and begin to allow that peace to immerse us, beginning with our thoughts, beginning with our thinking and our mind, and be aware of the dynamic of our minds. And a moment ago you made reference to the fact that we need to have self-examination. We need to look at ourselves. We need to look at the way that our minds operate. And if we find ourselves afraid a lot, if we find ourselves in this fear consciousness a lot, then we need to center our consciousness in peace, and we need to think about other things than the fear.
Yeah, that's a dynamite thought. And if we would do that, we wouldn't be fear-filled, because we would always be thinking of the positive, keeping our consciousness in present time, being aware of the good, and then there wouldn't be any room. The fact that what you just said, that there's only room for one thought at a time, is really inspiring. It's a dynamite thought, isn't it?
It is. And then that stops us from being paralyzed.
Yes.
Because the one thing about fear is it paralyzes us. It stops us from acting. It stops us from reacting, and it stops us from thinking. It breaks the cycle of positive thought and creative thought. And it is a damaging part of so many people's lives. And it's horrible to be afraid. It's awful to be afraid. Now, there are things that are good to be afraid of. It's good to be afraid.
Careful.
So that we're careful, right? We should be afraid for our own safety when we're walking off a ledge, or we should be fearful for our safety instead of putting our fingers in an electric plug. So there are things to be afraid of. But those are things that we create fears because we understand the consequences of them, and they're just realities in our life, and so we don't behave in that way. And in that case, those fears keep us from behaving in a certain way. And that's the way that we need to look at fear in all aspects of our lives, so that it keeps us from behaving in a certain way, not so that it paralyzes us, and not so that it frightens us, and not so that it keeps us from our good.
What I hear you saying is to help us be more careful. Fear is a good thing, but when it takes from us, then it's not. And that we can always be more careful by being thoughtful, and that's keeping our consciousness in the now too, isn't it?
Absolutely. Keeping our consciousness and our thought process in the present time, and to keep us thinking about one thing at a time. We always talk about techniques that we can use to release fear, and the thing that we always talk about is deep breathing, isn't it? And that's
Yes,
a
it
great
is.
thing. When we're afraid, it's good to take deep breaths.
Yes, and that always works because it helps us center ourselves to Creator God, and it helps us collect our own energies. And as you said, everything is energy. So we can create negative energy through our fear, or we can create positive energy through our faith and lack of fear. And so as we create that energy, we then are lighted from within. And we go through the day that way. So it's a good thing to protect ourselves the first thing in the morning, and then not be fearful, because we have the light of God around us, and we know that we have. And so to not give in to negative thinking of fear, and it's a conscious endeavor, isn't it?
It is. And to understand that we have within us the ability to deal with and cope with any reality of life. There's nothing that's going to happen to Iris or to Mike or to any of us that we're not going to be able to deal with. Things are going to happen in our lives. Difficulties are going to come. That's a reality of being human. That's a reality of the human experience. But to believe that in the midst of those difficult times, in the midst of those challenges, we have the ability to cope with whatever comes. And we can do it because of the dynamic of the creativity of our mind. We talk a lot about the connection of our mind with divine mind. That's just another way of saying when we unite ourselves with the presence and power of God, and it doesn't have to do with a church, it doesn't have to do with a religion or a faith tradition, it just has to do with a dynamic of simply uniting our thinking with the infinite, even for those who don't have any religious interest or spiritual interest, to connect our minds. Then we open the flow for us to be guided and directed, and we will be guided and directed. Our minds have the ability to solve every problem that can ever come into our life experience. And we need to believe that, and we need to know it, and we need to have faith in that reality. And when we do, then there's nothing more to fear. And there are going to be fearful times. There are going to be times when we're afraid. But in those times, we can grab hold of the fact that nothing is going to happen in our life that we cannot solve. And that doesn't mean that we take anything away from God or from the divine. Quite the contrary, because the resources that are given to us are those of mind and the creative power of mind. And that creative mind that we all have, that good sense that we all have, can get us through any circumstance or situation.
Yes, and that's being self-reliant, and we have to rely on ourselves. But as we're self-reliant, we also we rely upon a higher force, and it's just an innate part of us, knowing that we have that higher force available, energy available to us. And I think that as we think along those lines that you just expounded, we wouldn't have room for fear in our lives, would we?
No, we wouldn't have fear, and we would be able to cast aside the fears each time they come into our experience.
And life is so much more glorious and wonderful when we don't allow fear to assail us. And a lot of people say, well, how can I not, I have all these bad things happening in my life. How can I not be fearful? Well, they have a lot of good things happening in their life too. No one ever just has one thing happening in their lives. We all have all the things that we have, whatever they are. And so as we look to the good and claim it, then there's no room for fear.
And that's an absolutely wonderful way to end the program, by looking to the good and claiming the good in our lives. There's good in our life in the midst of every circumstance and situation. And no matter what you face, you have the ability to deal with it. You have the creative power of mind, and you will be guided and directed. So release the false evidence that appears real. Release the fears of your life. And Dr. Freelander and I have been sharing with you concepts and ideas for confident living. We hope you found this information useful, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
This program is a community outreach of Christ Church. Dr. Mike Costello speaks each Sunday morning at 11 a.m., and Dr. Iris Freelander speaks on Wednesday evenings at 7 p.m. at the church. On Sunday evenings at 6 p.m., there is a meditation and healing service. Come and join us. You will be warmly welcomed.